Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we trade our modern kitchens for the smoky mud-floored halls of the medieval world. You're standing now, squinting in the weak morning light, in a cold, damp, open field in Picardy, or maybe Wessex or Lombardy. The air smells thick with turned soil, wood smoke, and the faint, permanent stench of unwashed humanity. Before you, a dozen men, their faces weathered and hands calloused, struggle to guide a heavy wooden plough pulled by a team of slow, snorting oxen. You feel the chill seep through the rough-spun tunic you've somehow acquired, and your stomach gives a low, hungry growl. That growl, my friend, is your first clue. That deep, gnawing, physiological need for simple survival is the ultimate arbiter of value in this world. Everything, the wars, the marriages, the sermons, the very rhythm of the universe, revolves around the answer to one fundamental question, which was the most valuable crop in the medieval world. You might picture shimmering silks, or glinting gold exchanged for a pinch of rare spice. And yes, those things carried a formidable price tag. But, in a world where 2 out of every 10 children didn't make it past their first birthday, and the next harvest was never a certainty, monetary value is a distraction. The true measure of worth isn't what you spend to acquire a tiny luxury, but what you need to stay alive. And here's the cold, hard reality check. You probably won't survive this world if you can't get your hands on enough cereal grain. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is, and we can share this quiet moment across the miles. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You watch the oxen strain, their breath misting in the cool air, and you know instinctively what they are pulling, a furrow for grain. You see the seeds scattered carefully, destined to become the foundation of every single meal you will eat for the rest of your life. We are talking about cereals, wheat, rye, barley, and oats. In the medieval economy, these weren't just commodities, they were the essential, non-negotiable currency of existence. They weren't valuable just because they were traded because they were life itself. Think about it this way. Almost everything you encounter in the medieval landscape, the size of the village, the arrangement of the fields, the political power of the lord, the authority of the church, is literally built on a foundation of grain. The value of a crop can be measured by its ability to support and sustain a population, and no other crop comes close to the sheer caloric density and reliable yield of the major cereals. They are the 99% solution to the 100% problem of hunger. Let's dive into the core mainstream historical fact here. The medieval diet, for the vast majority of people, was staggeringly monotonous and heavily carbohydrate dependent. Estimates suggest that between 70% and 90% of the average peasant's caloric intake came directly from cereals. This intake was primarily in the form of bread, often a dense, dark, heavy loaf known as mashlin, a mix of wheat and rye, or just a coarse rye bread, or in porridges, pottages and grues. If the grain crop failed, the society didn't just suffer a dip in the economy, it suffered an existential collapse. Grain was the calorie base of Europe. Now, while we're talking about the dominance of grain, let's consider a quirky or fringe tidbit that underscores its necessity and versatility. Because clean water was often hard to come by, and sometimes actively dangerous, much of that grain was consumed not in solid food, but as a diluted fermented beverage, ale or beer. The brewing process, which involved boiling the water, made these drinks far safer than stagnant well water, and the very act of brewing meant that a massive percentage of the annual barley and oat crops were immediately converted into liquid sustenance. People weren't drinking ale to get drunk, they were drinking it to stay hydrated and alive. Some monasteries would calculate the daily ration of grain, not as a loaf of bread, but as a gallon or two of ale, ensuring a supply of safe hydration that often had more calories than their actual meals. You could quite literally survive on bread and ale for months, and many people did. This heavy dependence creates a massive headache for historians trying to categorize and quantify the true value. Historians still argue whether the true value of a crop should be calculated by its price per weight, its total acreage cultivated, or its total caloric contribution to the population. If you use price per weight, saffron is the winner, hands down. But if you measure what prevented society from imploding, wheat and rye win every time. We're talking about the difference between luxury and infrastructure. You need roads to have a society, and grain is the medieval road network. The very landscape reflects this valuation. As you look around this fictional field, you see the land divided not by fences but by custom in the open field system. This system was designed for the most efficient cultivation of cereals. The arable land was split into large fields, which were then subdivided into thin strips or salions, often worked by different families who shared access to the communal plough team like the one you see labouring now. This system was complex, cumbersome and inherently inefficient from a modern standpoint, but it was perfectly optimised for bulk production of the one thing that mattered: calories. The feudal contract itself was often paid in or benchmarked against grain. You, the imaginary peasant, don't pay your taxes in gold coins. You pay them in tithes, a tenth of your produce, which is primarily grain, delivered to the local church, and various feudal dues paid to the lord of the manor, also usually in kind. The entire political and religious power structure of Europe sits atop sacks of wheat, rye and barley. When the local lord assesses the value of his holding, he is essentially counting how many mouths the land can feed and how much surplus he can extract. That surplus is almost always grain. Think of grain as the GNP, gross national product, of the medieval world. It's the metric by which all wealth is ultimately measured, because without it, you can't field an army, you can't build a cathedral, and you certainly can't enjoy that tiny pinch of saffron. The luxury crops depended on the stability provided by the necessary crops. No grain, no peasants, no labour, no silk. It's a beautifully simple, terrifyingly rigid food chain. The weight of the harvest was a matter of life and death, monitored obsessively. The chroniclers recorded the quality of the harvest every year, not as an economic note, but as a pre-report on famine. A poor harvest in one region could lead to localized starvation. A poor harvest across multiple regions went mass catastrophe, and the medieval period was riddled with such disasters, proving that the value of grain was infinite when you needed it, and its supply perilously finite. Even the tools of the trade speak to the primacy of grain. The heavy-wheeled plough, the development of the horse collar, remember that detail for later, the harrow, the sickle. These are all innovations centered on maximizing cereal yield. The effort invested into perfecting the method of sowing, cultivating and milling grain dwarfs the effort put into any other crop. It's the only crop that requires specialized architecture, the windmill or watermill, to process it efficiently. The miller, often a powerful and resented figure in the village, controlled access to the finished product, the flour, and could literally hold the community's survival in his hands. So, as you stand in this cold field, listening to the creak of the plough, remember that you are witnessing the medieval world's most profound economic act. The value isn't theoretical, it's baked into the bread that sits on your wooden trencher. On the western side, it's in the ale you sip. It is the reason you, and every person around you, is still drawing breath. We must begin here with the basic bulk calorie, before we can even consider the fleeting value of spices or the regional might of grapes. Grain is the baseline, the foundation, the indispensable king of the medieval crop hierarchy. You stand there in the field, watching the slow, grinding work of turning the earth, and you realize that the sheer value of grain, that indispensable caloric currency we just talked about, is fundamentally tied to the technology used to produce it. The only way to feed millions and sustain a civilization built on feudalism and faith is to make the land yield massive quantities of that necessary cereal. And in the medieval world, this depended entirely on the heavy plough and the system of fallow. Without these two factors, grain remains a local, small-scale food source, not the political bedrock of a continent. Look closely at the machine lumbering through the mud. This isn't the light, scratchy wooden implement of Roman times, the aratrum. This is the revolutionary, massive, heavy-wheeled plough, sometimes called the caruca. It's a beast, requiring up to 8 oxen or 4 horses, hence the communal nature of the plough team you are observing. It has several key innovations that profoundly change the value calculation of every crop grown in northern Europe. First, it features a coulter, a knife-like vertical blade that cuts the sod. Second, a heavy horizontal share, the ploughshare, cuts the ground below the sod. And third, and most crucial, is the mould board, a curved wooden or iron plate that lifts the heavy wet clay soil of northern Europe and turns it completely over, forming that deep furrow you were watching. This mainstream historical fact, the adoption of the heavy plough, cannot be overstated. The lighter Roman plough was fine for the thin, dry, sandy soils of the Mediterranean, but the thick, damp, fertile but difficult clay soils of places like England, France and Germany required this brute force. By turning the soil over completely, the plough buried weeds and aerated the subsoil, unlocking the deep nutrients and dramatically increasing the potential yield for the grain crop planter. It turned previously marginal, unworkable land into highly valuable arable land. Suddenly, a lord's wealth wasn't just determined by the amount of land he held, but the type of land that could now be tamed by this heavy iron tool. The price of iron itself, and the labour of the blacksmith who forged the share and coulter, became inextricably linked to the value of the grain harvest. Now, while the heavy plough made bulk grain production possible, it also led to an interesting social dilemma, a quirky or fringe tidbit that reveals the underlying economic strain. Because the Karuka required such a massive investment in draft animals and labour, a full team might represent the entire working capital of a small village. It naturally led to a greater consolidation of power. Peasants who owned only a small strip of land and couldn't afford even one ox were forced into collaboration or outright dependency on those who could. The value of grain, therefore, was not only tied to the land, but to the shared capital required to farm it. This dependency became so ingrained that in many regions, owning a piece of a plough team, literally, owning a plough ox's share, was a recognised unit of social and economic standing, dictating a person's rights and responsibilities in the communal field system. It meant you had a seat at the table, literally and figuratively, when the village decided how to divide the precious land. The second half of the agricultural revolution, which gave grain its overwhelming market value, was the system of fallow and rotation. You can't just grow wheat year after year. Even the rich, turned-over soil will become exhausted, and yields will crash. The solution, which had been developing since Roman times, reached its medieval perfection in the three-field system. Look to the north of the field you're in. That land is lying deliberately untouched, brown and quiet. That's the fallow field. In the two-field system, half the land was planted, and half lay fallow rested for a whole year to recover its nitrogen and moisture. But by the 11th century, in many of the best developed regions, this was optimized into the three-field system. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of the three-field system was a cause or a result of the rising medieval population and economic boom. Did people start rotating crops because they needed more food for a growing populace? Or did the rotation system allow the population to grow in the first place? Regardless, its economic impact on grain valuation was profound. Here's how it worked and why it mattered. The arable land was divided into three great fields. Field 1, planted with a valuable winter-sown cereal, usually wheat or rye, harvested in summer. Field 2, planted with a lower value but still vital spring-sown crop, usually oats or barley, or crucially legumes, which we'll cover later, harvested in early autumn. Field 3, left fallow, grazed by animals whose manure naturally fertilized the land for the next year. This system immediately increased the land under cultivation from 50% to roughly 66% in any given year. That's a 33% increase in productivity for the society as a whole, simply by smarter scheduling. This meant more cereal grain could be extracted as tax tithe and rent, directly increasing the wealth and power of the elites. No other crop's value was so directly enhanced by a systemic agricultural innovation on this scale. If you were a lord, the most valuable crop you could command was the one whose yield you could reliably increase through clever management. Wheat and rye fit this bill perfectly. The economic genius of this system was its risk mitigation. If the winter wheat failed due to hard frosts, you still had the spring-sown oats or barley to fall back on. This guaranteed a minimum supply of basic calories and animal fodder, stabilizing the social fabric. Now, let's revisit the fallow field. It wasn't truly wasted. It was an essential part of the production cycle. After the grain was harvested, the remaining stubble was grazed by the village livestock, the cows, sheep and pigs. This was a form of communal subsidy. The animals ate the stubble and any remaining weed seeds, and in return, they deposited their manure, their dung, which was the primary source of fertilizer in the medieval world. This manure was the real medieval gold, making the next year's grain harvest possible. This interlocking system highlights the deep value chain of the grain economy. The value of the wheat was tied to the health of the barley which fed the horse, which was tied to the fertility of the fallow field, which was tied to the production of the livestock and their manure, which were themselves dependent on the stubble remaining after the wheat harvest. It's an economic circle, and cereal grain is the anchor holding the entire system together. Contrast this with the cultivation of a specialty crop, say, the grapevine. A vineyard is a monoculture. It takes up permanent space, is highly susceptible to localized disease, and its value, while high, is tied almost exclusively to consumption by the wealthy or for sacramental purposes. It doesn't feed the oxen, it doesn't house the pigs, it doesn't give you a secure alternative if your main crop fails. In the face of starvation, the choice is clear. The crop that enables the rotation and feeds the most mouths wins the value contest. You feel the ground vibrate slightly as the plough team moves past you. The effort is immense, but the results, a well-prepared field destined for the most valuable commodity in Europe, justify the struggle. The heavy plough revolution and the three-field system didn't just increase harvests, they fundamentally increased the power of the people who control the land. A baron's influence could be measured in the number of moldboards he owned and the acres of turned earth he commanded. Without this technology focused overwhelmingly on grain production, the medieval world simply couldn't have transitioned from the fragmented, low-population societies of the Dark Ages into the more complex cathedral-building, university-founding societies of the High Middle Ages. The massive, steady supply of grain was the fuel. We talk about the medieval economy being static, but these agricultural reforms were dynamic, slow-motion revolutions that took centuries to spread, but once established, placed an undeniable Columbus value on the staple cereals, wheat and rye above all. Remember that feeling of hunger we established in Section 1. The plough you are watching is the only thing standing between that growl and absolute famine. And that, my friend, is a value beyond price. You've established that cereal grain is the essential infrastructure of the medieval world, made possible by the heavy plough and the three-field system. Now, let's peel back the curtain on the grain itself, because not all cereals were created equal. They carried not just a caloric value, but a deep, visible social value, creating a stark class divide right in the breadbasket. Specifically, we need to focus on the powerful distinction between wheat and rye. You wipe a smear of mud from your rough-spun tunic and imagine sitting down for dinner. The kind of bread on your table is the clearest social marker you possess. For the vast majority of the population, the serfs and the poor peasantry, their daily bread was made predominantly from rye, or a mixed grain known as maslin, a mix of wheat and rye, or wheat and barley. This bread was dark, dense, and robust. It was nutritious and cheap to produce, especially because rye is a hardier crop than wheat. Rye has a fantastic mainstream historical fact going for it. It is incredibly tolerant of poor soil, wet conditions, and harsh cold climates. In the northern and eastern reaches of Europe, Germany, Poland, Scandinavia, and much of eastern France and England's poorer soils, rye was the dominant and most reliable cereal. It could be planted in marginal land where delicate wheat would fail, providing a surer, if coarser, harvest. This resilience made it the most valuable crop for sheer survival in difficult environments. It was the insurance policy of the poor. Its prevalence meant that for millions, rye was the cornerstone of life, sustaining the labour force that supported the entire feudal structure. However, moving to the manor house, the castle, or the monastery, and you immediately enter the kingdom of wheat. Wheat requires better soil, more careful cultivation, and a longer, warmer growing season, making it a higher-risk, higher-prestige crop. When you bite into a loaf of fine white wheat bread, what we would recognise as true white bread, you are literally eating wealth. The fine texture and pale colour were indicators of aristocratic status and purity. The church, too, insisted on using white wheat wafers for the Eucharist. This spiritual requirement instantly boosted the political and symbolic value of wheat, far above that of rye. This distinction between the dark, common rye bread and the white, aristocratic wheat bread is a fantastic illustration of how value isn't purely economic, it's cultural and political. The Lord didn't just eat wheat because he could afford it. He ate wheat because it visually differentiated him from the peasantry. You are what you eat, and in the medieval world, the grain on your plate was an immediate social manifesto. The demand for white wheat flour drove its price consistently higher than rye, even though rye often produced a greater bulk yield on the same amount of land. This premium price makes wheat arguably the more valuable crop per bushel in terms of currency. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit that reveals the hidden danger lurking in the peasant's rye diet, the threat of ergot. Rye is particularly susceptible to a fungus, Clavacips purpurea, which produces hard, dark kernels containing powerful psychoactive and toxic alkaloids. When milled into flour and baked into bread, this fungus caused the horrifying disease known as St. Anthony's fire ergotism. The symptoms were terrifying, burning sensations in the limbs, hence the fire. Involutions, gangrene that could cause limbs to literally drop off, and vivid hallucinations. Imagine your survival staple, the very source of your life, suddenly transforming into a source of madness and death. Localized outbreaks of ergotism were devastating, particularly in years with wet harvests, proving that the high value of rye for survival came with a dark, terrifying risk that the wheat-eating aristocracy largely avoided. The fact that the poor frequently risked such a harrowing death while the rich did not only widened the chasm between the two grains' social standing. This dual nature of the primary calorie source leads us directly to a key scholarly quandary. Historians still argue whether the dominance of wheat in the medieval record is an accurate reflection of its acreage cultivated, or simply a byproduct of clerical and aristocratic bias in a surviving documentation. That is, did scribes write more about wheat because it was important to the people who commissioned the records, or because there was simply more of it? Since peasants' lives and accounts were rarely recorded, the sheer volume of rye grown and consumed by the silent majority is often underestimated, potentially skewing our modern valuation toward the high-status wheat. The difference in how the two crops were treated in trade and taxation also speaks to their relative value. Wheat was the preferred crop for long-distance trade. It was often shipped in bulk from fertile regions, like Sicily or Flanders, to densely populated urban centres or to areas with poor soil. It travelled well and commanded a higher market price at its destination. Rye, on the other hand, was largely grown for local consumption. It was a regional commodity, sustaining the local population and paying the local dues. The lord would extract rye from his peasants for local consumption, or to feed his own retainers, but he'd often prefer to collect wheat or the money gained from selling wheat to purchase luxury goods or mercenaries. You can observe this difference in the medieval prices' current price lists. While grain prices fluctuated wildly year to year based on the harvest, a clear and consistent gap always existed between wheat and rye. Wheat acted more like a hard currency, an internationally recognized, easily liquidated asset. Rye was more like a local token, necessary for internal commerce and survival, but less useful for acquiring goods from distant lands. The shift from the two-field to the three-field system, which we discussed earlier, also indirectly elevated the overall value of the land for producing both grains. By creating a smarter rotation cycle, a single stretch of land could consistently support both the winter-sown cereal, often wheat or rye, and the spring-sown crop oats or barley. This efficiency made every acre exponentially more valuable, but the final yield was always graded, priced and consumed, based on the wheat-rye class barrier. Imagine a farmer, a serf named Thomas, working his strips of land. He is desperately hoping for a good rye harvest, because that is his family's guarantee against starvation and the bulk of his payment to the lord. But he also nurses a small patch of wheat, or maybe just a higher proportion of wheat in his maslin mix, because that sliver of high-status grain is what he will sell at market for a few extra pennies, or what he will bake for his daughter's wedding feast, a symbolic elevation of his family's standing. His whole life is a balance between the necessity of rye and the aspirational value of wheat. Ultimately, while wheat held the undisputed crown for monetary value, religious sanctity, and social prestige, rye held the crown for bulk production, environmental resilience, and pure survival value for the masses. If the question is, most valuable, in terms of supporting the largest number of people in the harshest conditions, rye gives wheat a strong challenge. But for the purposes of building the political and economic power of the elite, the people who controlled the surplus and directed the armies, wheat was the preferred and therefore most powerful crop. You're beginning to see that value is a layered and highly subjective concept in this world, dictated by both the stomach and the status of the consumer. You've now established that wheat is the currency of the elite and rye is the staff of life for the peasant, making them the two most potent cereals in terms of direct human consumption and social value. But the agricultural system, and indeed the entire medieval economy, required more than just human fuel. It needed horsepower, literally, and that, my friend, brings us to the crucial, underestimated value of barley and oats. Look back at the heavy plough teams struggling in the field. If those draft animals are horses, which became increasingly common in the High Middle Ages, due to their superior speed and pulling power compared to oxen. They are massive, hungry consumers of grain. A warhorse, a destrier, or even a simple cart horse requires a vast amount of energy. That energy source, the fuel for medieval logistics, trade and warfare, was predominantly oats. Oats are the mainstream historical fact here when discussing non-human caloric value. They are the quintessential fodder crop of northern Europe. Without reliable large-scale cultivation of oats, the heavy plough revolution would have stalled, and the mounted knight, the icon of medieval military power, would have been an economic impossibility. The cost of maintaining a knight was often calculated not just in armour and land, but in the sheer tonnage of oats required to feed his stable of horses. When you hear about an army devastating a region, they aren't just taking the gold, they're seizing the oats, knowing that without fodder, the enemy's cavalry and logistics literally grind to a halt. The value of oats is therefore an indirect strategic and military value, essential for powering the systems that protected or destroyed the crops grown for human consumption. Now let's talk about barley. Barley is another versatile grain, often overshadowed by its flashier cousins but carrying immense hidden value. It was certainly eaten by the poorest people, often mixed into pottages or baked into coarse flack breads where rye wouldn't grow well or was too expensive. But its greatest value lay in three areas: as a crucial element in crop rotation, as a secondary animal feed, and most importantly, in brewing. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit about the economic function of oats. They weren't just for the cavalry and the heavy haulage animals. In times of hardship, oats also served as the primary feed for pigs, the most valuable domestic meat source for the peasantry. Pigs are incredibly efficient converters of low-quality feed into high-quality protein pork, and their foraging ability in the forests and on the stubble was legendary. However, to fatten them up before the critical autumn slaughter, they were often finished on oats and sometimes barley. Therefore, the value of the medieval pork supply, which was essential for survival through the winter, was directly tied to the availability of the oat crop. When the oats failed, the pigs couldn't be fattened, and the potential winter meat supply dwindled, demonstrating the interconnectedness of the medieval food economy. The dual role of these grains, feeding both the poor and the powerful horses, leads to an interesting valuation problem. Historians still argue whether the per-acre value of a crop like barley, which fed the poorest population and served as the foundational ingredient for brewing, truly exceeded that of lower-yielding wheat in terms of overall societal utility and economic stability. In a region where every peasant drank ale, the consistent reliability of the barley crop was arguably a greater guarantor of social peace and health than a smaller, more expensive wheat yield. Let's zero in on the importance of barley in brewing. This ties directly into the next section, but it is impossible to separate the value of the grain from the value of the beverage it created. As we lightly touched upon earlier, ale and beer made primarily from barley, often mixed with oats, were not luxury drinks. They were a necessity. The process of boiling the mash killed pathogens present in water sources, making the resulting ale safer for everyone, including children, than drinking unboiled well or river water. It also added vital calories to a meagre diet. The social contract of the manor often included a minimum daily ration of ale for farm labourers. This means that a significant portion of the annual barley harvest was instantly transformed from a raw commodity into a manufactured product, essentially a processed foodstuff, which was then used as liquid currency, wage payment and hydration. This transformation added immense value. The brewer, often the manor house or a local woman who ran a successful cottage industry, was adding labour and time to the crop, turning mere grain into a highly liquid, universally desired and safer form of subsistence. Think of the value chain. The barley starts as simple seed, is planted and harvested, and then, instead of being milled into flour for low-value porridge, it is steeped, boiled and fermented into ale. The finished product, ale, can be traded, sold or used to pay for other goods and services, giving barley a liquidity value, pun intended, that was perhaps higher than rye. While wheat was great for taxes, barley was great for daily transactions and local commerce, acting as a highly functional low-denomination currency. Furthermore, barley had distinct advantages in the three-field rotation system. It was typically the spring-sown crop, following the winter wheat or rye. It required less nitrogen than wheat, and matured quickly, making it an ideal follow-up crop that didn't unduly stress the soil. Its ability to thrive in the spring rotation field enhanced the overall value of the agricultural system. proving that the most valuable crop is sometimes the one that best complements the others, optimizing the total annual yield of the entire estate. You observe a horse pulling a cart loaded with sheaves of what look like oats. The rhythmic clip-clop of its hoofs is a sound of productivity and movement. Without that oat crop, the heavy plough would have to rely entirely on slower, weaker oxen, dramatically slowing the pace of all agricultural, military, and commercial activity. The transition to horsepower, which was fueled by oats, essentially sped up the entire medieval economy. That speed, the ability to transport goods faster and plough fields quicker, is an intangible but massive source of value derived directly from the humble oat. In summary, neither barley nor oats could compete with wheat or rye on the grounds of direct prestige human caloric intake or taxation revenue, but they were absolutely indispensable. Oats provided the strategic and military fuel for transport or warfare, enabling the entire power structure to function. Barley provided the ubiquitous liquid currency and safe hydration for the masses, making it a critical foundation for social stability in the local economy. Their value is the value of infrastructure and stability, the crops that enable the high-value crops to get to market and the people to remain alive and able to work the fields. They are the essential supporting players, without whom the stars of the show, wheat and rye, would simply collapse. You've explored the grains that fuel the body and the beasts, the essential calories of wheat, rye, barley and oats. But there is a massive hidden layer of value derived from these crops, especially barley and oats, that has nothing to do with food and everything to do with public health, social structure and liquid currency, the value of ale and beer. Walk into the common room of a tavern, or perhaps a peasant's cottage in the early evening. The air is thick, warm and smells yeasty. Everyone, from the infant to the aged patriarch, is drinking a fermented beverage. This is not a choice of hedonism, it is often a matter of survival. The value of the cereal crop, particularly barley, is amplified exponentially because it solves the medieval world's most persistent, silent killer, contaminated water. The mainstream historical fact is that the process of brewing, which involves boiling the grain and water mixture, the mash, effectively pasteurized the liquid, killing off most of the waterborne pathogens that cause dysentery, typhoid, and other lethal diseases. In a world where urban centres were expanding and sanitation was essentially non-existent, think of the waste being thrown into the streets and finding its way into wells and rivers. The value of a safe, potable drink cannot be overstated. Ale was not a luxury, it was the public health system of the medieval era. Its reliability saved lives, ensured the labour force remained somewhat functional, and therefore was arguably the most valuable contribution of the barley crop to the overall stability of the medieval world. This necessity turned the brewing ingredients into a high-value industrial resource. Barley, the primary base, and oats, often used in northern regions, suddenly carried a value that transcends their caloric contribution. They were the raw material for a universally consumed, life-saving manufactured good. The local economy often revolved around the brewer, frequently a woman, known as the alewife, who converted the farmer's low-value raw grain into high-value, ready-to-use liquid currency. The sheer volume is staggering. Historical estimates suggest that people drank immense amounts of ale daily, sometimes up to a gallon per person, across all ages. This required a huge reliable surplus of barley. If the barley crop failed, it wasn't just a food shortage, it was a hydration crisis. The only alternative was often wine, which was expensive and regionally limited, or water, which was a gamble. This extreme dependence means that a stable barley crop provided an economic underpinning far greater than its price per bushel might suggest. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit that illustrates the economic sophistication of this liquid value, the practice of using ale as partial wage payment. Farmhands, labourers, servants, and even specialised artisans were often given a portion of their daily wage in kind, specifically in ale. This served several purposes. It ensured the labourer was fed and hydrated, thus able to work. It kept the liquid supply constantly circulating, and it conserved the lord's or master's precious metal currency. In places, ale was literally a low-denomination currency, exchangeable for minor services or small goods. The crop that facilitates the paying of wages and the daily operation of the workforce surely deserves a high valuation score. This monetary function leads directly into a key debate. Historians still argue whether the consistent economic value and liquidity provided by barley's conversion into ale made it over time a more reliable foundation for local commerce and wealth extraction than the fluctuating price of wheat. Wheat brought in a high price at market, but barley, constantly being converted into a necessary liquid tradable good, provided a steadier stream of income and local stability. It was the oil that greased the wheels of the local economy. We must also consider the role of hops. While many early medieval ales were made with a mixture of herbs and spices known as gruit, which was often taxed and controlled by local lords, giving the gruit right a monopoly value, the use of hops spread throughout Europe in the later medieval period. Hops act as a preservative and add bitterness, allowing the beer to be stored for longer, enabling it to be traded over greater distances and across longer periods of time. The adoption of hops, therefore, added a new, secondary crop with enormous value, the preservative that increased the shelf life and tradability of the primary crop barley. Think about the church again. The monasteries were often the most sophisticated brewers in the land, mastering the techniques not only for health and sustenance, but also for profit. Monastic orders controlled massive agricultural estates, and their brewing operations were major sources of income. They needed vast quantities of barley and oats. The value of these crops, therefore, was directly tied to the wealth and influence of the most powerful institutions in Europe. Contrast us with the value of wine, which we will discuss later. Wine was high value, but almost entirely restricted to the elite, the nobility and the church, for both sacramental and celebratory purposes. It didn't sustain the masses. Ale, by contrast, was universal. It was consumed in every manor, every hovel, every city, every day. A crop that is necessary for daily survival, public health, social lubrication and wage payment for 90% of the population, carries an aggregate value that is enormous. The physical labour involved in brewing also speaks to the value of the grain. Turning barley into a life-sustaining safe beverage was a constant, time-consuming process. The specialised vessels, the fire management, the grinding, the steeping, it all required dedicated labour and resources. This added labour cost to the raw grain increased its market value exponentially, turning a few sacks of barley into an essential, ready-to-consume product. Imagine the anxiety of a village during a dry summer. They aren't just worried about the wheat for bread, they are terrified about the barley for ale. If the barley fails, they don't just starve, they face a summer of dangerous contaminated water, leading to sickness that prevents them from working the next harvest. The value of barley and oats, therefore, is ultimately the value of social functionality. It is the lubricant that keeps the medieval machine turning, ensuring the labour force remains healthy enough to plant, tend and harvest the wheat and rye that pay the taxes and tithes. While wheat might be the high-denomination banknote for the lord, barley is the ubiquitous coin that passes through every hand, every single day. The conversion of cereal grain into a safe liquid calorie source is one of the most effective ways the medieval world managed to sustain high populations in complex societies, proving that a crop's value is often hidden in its transformation and utility, not just its raw form. It turns a simple grain into a complex life-saving infrastructure. You have spent 5 sections firmly anchored in the essential bulk value crops, the cereals that feed the people, fuel the beasts, and provide safe hydration. Now, we must turn our gaze from the necessities of the field to the shimmering high-stakes realm of luxury crops. These crops, while grown in tiny quantities or imported at immense cost, challenge our definition of valuable, because of their astronomical monetary value per ounce or per pound. In the early morning air of the manor, you catch a whiff of something exotic, something sharp and strange that momentarily cuts through the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. It might be a pinch of cloves, ground for the Lord's morning pottage, or perhaps a dash of cinnamon reserved for a festive occasion. These spices, along with silk and, increasingly later in the period, sugar, are the high-value, low-volume goods of the medieval economy. They are the true hard currency of international trade, capable of making and breaking fortunes with a single shipment. The mainstream historical fact here is the astonishing price of spices. During the Middle Ages, spices like pepper, ginger and cloves were so expensive that they often served as a form of portable wealth, a kind of bank account that could be easily transported and traded across vast distances. Pepper, for instance, was frequently counted out peppercorn by peppercorn, and in some contexts was even used to pay rents, tolls and fines, a concept that gave rise to the phrase peppercorn rent, a nominal or symbolic payment. Why the insane valuation? Primarily because of distance and risk. The spices travelled thousands of miles from their origins in India, Southeast Asia and the Far East, crossing multiple borders, mountains and seas. At every step of the journey, from the initial grower to the arable Venetian merchant, for the Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa, which monopolized the trade, a hefty tax, tariff or profit margin was applied. The final price in London or Paris reflected the cost of transporting the entire world to your kitchen. They're not technically a crop. It's production from the mulberry tree, a cultivated crop, and the silkworm makes it an agricultural commodity of immense value. Silk was the ultimate symbol of wealth, status and piety. Wearing silk identified you instantly as a member of the elite, and its use in church vestments and altar cloths gave it a spiritual value alongside its monetary worth. The attempt by Western powers, particularly the Byzantines, to break the Chinese monopoly on silk production, often involving espionage and the smuggling of silkworm eggs, underscores just how desperately Europe sought to control this valuable resource. This leads us to a quirky or fringe tidbit that perfectly encapsulates the difference between necessity and luxury value: the medieval belief in the medicinal properties of spices. Spices were not primarily used to mask the taste of rancid meat, a common modern misconception. They were considered crucial ingredients in four humours-based medical theory. Ginger, for example, might be prescribed to balance cold. Humours, while cinnamon was thought to be a preventative against plague. This perceived health benefit was exploited by merchants, who inflated the prices by claiming their spices possessed curative or even magical properties, further cementing their extraordinary market value. The introduction of sugar from the Islamic world, and later, via the Crusades and new cultivation in the Mediterranean like Cyprus and Sicily, provided another ultra-high value crop. Initially used as a spice and a medicine, refined sugar was the ultimate status symbol, replacing honey at the tables of the super-rich. It was so expensive that wealthy merchants often kept it locked up in separate spice cabinets. The cost of a small cone of refined sugar could easily exceed the annual income of a peasant family. So, how do we weigh the worth of an ounce of cloves, which might be worth an ounce of silver, against a bushel of wheat, which might sustain a family for a month? Historians still argue whether the wealth generated by the international trade in high-value luxury goods like spices was more economically significant for the development of medieval Europe than a local stability and population growth supported by bulk cereal production. The spice trade certainly created massive capital and led to the rise of powerful financial centres in Italy, which financed wars and built navies. This capital was transformative, concentrated and explosive. However, the cereal economy provided the base layer, the millions of consumers and the stable society upon which that high-stakes trade could operate. Without the millions of peasants successfully harvesting grain, there would be no society for the rich to sell their ginger and silk to. The value of these luxury crops is one of concentration and leverage. The amount of wealth concentrated in a single sack of pepper was huge, giving the owner immense commercial power. One man could become instantly rich through a successful spice voyage. In contrast, the value of the wheat crop was spread thinly across the land, supporting millions but making few ultra-wealthy. The very notion of the Crusades, while fueled by religious fervour, was underpinned by a desire for greater access to the source of these valuable Eastern goods. The Italian city-states essentially built their empires by acting as the exclusive distributors of these luxury crops, controlling the flow of pepper, cinnamon and sugar into Europe. The value of these commodities drove geopolitical strategy, a testament to their worth. However, from the perspective of the man standing in the field, watching the plough, the value of luxury crops is almost abstract. They don't fill his belly, they don't pay his feudal dues, and they won't save his family from the next famine. They are the spoils of an entirely different game, a game of trade, not survival. They were essential for the nobility's definition of a high-value life, but not for the masses' definition of existence. We can conclude that while luxury crops held the title of most valuable monetarily price per weight, they utterly failed the test of most valuable societally survival and infrastructure. They were the diamond jewellery worn by the few, while grain was the very air breathed by all. We will keep their concentrated value in mind as we continue to build our argument. But remember, a famine is never averted by a shipload of pepper. You've stepped out of the vast fields of cereal and the teeming harbours of the spice trade, and now you are invited to contemplate the paradox of extreme scarcity. We've established that luxury crops carry enormous monetary value, but none embody this high-stakes, low-volume contradiction quite like saffron. Imagine you are in a sunny, arid corner of Spain, perhaps La Mancha, or possibly even a small protected plot in southern England or France where ambitious monks are attempting cultivation. You are looking at a field of delicate, pale purple flowers, the saffron crocus, Crocus sativus. The sun is warm and the work is meticulous, painstaking and unbelievably time-consuming. This plant, requiring specific conditions and massive labour investment for a vanishingly small yield, produces the single most expensive substance by weight in the medieval world that was derived from a cultivated crop. The value of saffron is rooted in its anatomy. The actual spice consists only of the tiny, deep crimson stigmas of the flower. A single crocus flower produces exactly 3 stigmas. The mainstream historical fact that establishes saffron's unbelievable worth is the sheer quantity required for a single pound of the final product. It takes somewhere between 70,000 and 250,000 hand-picked flowers to yield just 1 pound of dried saffron threads. The harvesting must be done quickly and by hand in the early morning to preserve the flavour and colour, often leading to frantic, labour-intensive campaigns. This phenomenal labour requirement and minuscule yield meant that saffron was literally worth its weight in gold, and often traded as such. Its concentrated value made it the ultimate high-denomination banknote for medieval commerce. It was used in small amounts by the elite for 3 main purposes: as a rare and vibrant yellow dye for the finest garments, as a flavouring and colouring agent in the most extravagant dishes, and, crucially, as a medicine. Use in medicines where its value often skyrocketed. Medieval physicians, adhering to the principles of Galenic medicine, believed saffron possessed powerful properties for balancing the humours, especially for treating melancholy and for cleansing the blood. Because it was believed to be effective and cost so much, only the most powerful and wealthy could afford treatments involving saffron, further cementing its status as a luxury commodity. The perceived power of saffron was so strong that it even became a geopolitical asset, leading to the Saffron War of 1374 in Germany, a minor skirmish that perfectly illustrates how seriously its value was taken. Now, let's inject a quirky or fringe tidbit that underscores its risk and rarity: the persistent problem of adulteration. Because saffron was so valuable, the temptation to dilute it or fake it entirely was immense. Merchants would often mix cheaper, less valuable products, like dried calendula petals, turmeric, or even shredded beef muscle with genuine saffron threads. This practice was so common that medieval cities instituted strict laws and punishments, including fines, imprisonment, and even execution for those caught selling fraudulent saffron. A fact that entire legal and punitive systems were developed just to protect the purity of this one tiny crop is a testament to the immense monetary value it carried. This extreme valuation forces a central point in our debate. Historians still argue whether a crop whose total annual yield could be carried on the back of one mule, but whose per-weight price was higher than silver, should be considered more valuable than a bulk crop that sustained entire populations but sold cheaply. It's the ultimate comparison between the value of a banknote and the value of oxygen. Saffron provided concentrated, exchangeable wealth for the few, while wheat provided diffused, essential life support for the many. Saffron's high price also meant it was one of the first crops to attract intense scrutiny from traders and financiers. Its predict, controlling a supply route or a successful growing region, like the city of Saffron Walden in England, gave local elites an income stream entirely out of proportion to the size of the land used. The very nature of saffron cultivation is a stark contrast to the cereal fields we've been discussing. Wheat requires large open fields and communal heavy machinery. Saffron requires small, intensely cultivated plots and individual specialized human labor. It is the antithesis of the bulk economy. You couldn't pay a tithe to the church in saffron. The quantity would be ridiculous, and the church preferred reliable bulk goods that could feed its retinue. You couldn't feed an army on saffron. You couldn't brew safe water with saffron. The concentrated wealth from saffron, or any rare spice, allowed a lord to buy a suit of armour, hire a mercenary, or commission a grand piece of art. This is what we call buying power. But this buying power was ultimately convertible back into the bulk crops that were necessary to sustain the mercenary, the artist, and the household. The value of saffron, therefore, is ultimately parasitic. It derives its final, usable value from its ability to purchase the true essentials. Imagine trying to survive a famine with a sole precious bag of saffron. You might be able to trade it for enough wheat to feed your family for a week, but only if the local wheat holder is willing to trade a caloric staple for a spice. In a true crisis, When survival is the only metric, the owner of a ton of rye grain holds far more practical, life-sustaining power than the owner of a pound of saffron. So while saffron stands as the undisputed king of monetary value per weight among all crops, its lack of utility, its tiny volume, and its inability to perform the necessary functions of feeding the masses, paying the majority of taxes, or structuring the agricultural system, disqualifies it from the title of the most valuable crop in the broadest societal sense. It's the ultimate symbol of concentrated wealth, but not of widespread life-giving necessity. The power of saffron is intense but narrow. The power of cereal is diffused but absolute. You shift your focus now from the high, arid field of precious saffron to the terraced, sun-drenched hillsides of southern and central Europe. Here, the landscape is sculpted by a different kind of agricultural ambition, the vineyard. The grape, and its ultimate product wine, represents a crop whose value is deeply intertwined with religious necessity, concentrated wealth, and political control, offering a regional rival to the supremacy of cereal. The value of the grapevine is immediately apparent in its permanence. Unlike annual crops like wheat and barley, a vineyard represents a generational investment. Planting a vine is an act of faith. It takes several years before the first viable harvest, and a vine can produce for decades, sometimes over a century. This long-term return on investment meant that vineyards were considered highly stable, fixed assets, often valued far higher per acre than even the richest arable land. A stretch of well-tended, producing vineyard was a guarantee of future income, provided you had the capital and patience to wait for it. The mainstream historical fact establishing wine's immense importance is its sacramental role in the Christian Mass. Wine was not optional. It was absolutely essential for the Eucharist, the central ritual of the Church. This immediate, universal and non-negotiable demand across all of Europe, even in non-wine-producing regions where it had to be imported, gave the grapevine a profound spiritual and political value. The Church, the most powerful institution of the age, became one of the largest vineyard owners and producers. Monasteries, in particular, perfected viticulture and winemaking, ensuring a constant pure supply for their own needs and generating a massive surplus for trade. Controlling the vineyards was literally controlling the means of production for salvation. Now, consider the social and political control aspect. The best vineyards were located near rivers, coasts, or major trade routes, ensuring the product, wine, being a high-volume, relatively heavy liquid, could be transported efficiently. This facilitated a massive commercial value. Wine became the second great traded liquid commodity after ale, but unlike ale, it retained its value over long distances and appealed primarily to the elite and urban populations. Regions like Bordeaux, Burgundy, and the Rhineland built vast economies and political influence on the quality and volume of their vintages. This concentration of control leads us to a quirky or fringe tidbit about medieval winemaking, the practice of adding water to wine. While wine was a high-status drink, it was often consumed diluted with water, sometimes for flavour, but often simply to make the expensive commodity stretch further, or because strong, unmixed wine was deemed unhealthy or excessive. Furthermore, the practice of lacing wine, adding spices, honey, or even lead for sweetness was common. The value of the wine crop was therefore enhanced by secondary additives, which sometimes masked poor quality or were considered essential for making it palatable or medically sound. The purity of the wine was often less important than its availability and symbolic value. The regional contrast here is stark. In the Mediterranean and wine-producing river valleys, the grapevine was undeniably one of the most valuable crops, supporting a huge infrastructure of coopers, barrel makers, transporters, and merchants. But in northern Europe, where the climate was too harsh, the value of the grapevine was purely that of an extremely high-cost import, serving the needs of the aristocracy and the church, but offering zero value to the local peasant economy or the agricultural system. This dichotomy gives rise to a critical scholarly question. Historians still argue whether the extreme concentration of capital and infrastructure, cooperages, ships, specialized storage generated by the wine trade outweighs the diffused general wealth generated by the omnipresent grain economy when calculating the most valuable crop. Wine created great financial centers, grain created great populations. Which one truly underpinned the medieval world more effectively? It's a clear case of high profit versus high utility. A lord with a successful vineyard could generate cash or wine itself, which was as good as cash to fund ventures far beyond his territory. He could buy mercenaries, acquire expensive Italian armour, or finance a trip to Rome. The value of his vineyard was liquid and mobile. In contrast, the value of his wood harvest was fixed to the immediate needs of his tenants in his household. The value of the vineyard also influenced land tenure and law. Land dedicated to vines was often held under different, more specialized, and sometimes more privileged arrangements than arable cereal land, reflecting its higher, more specialized output. Protecting the terroir in the long-term investment required specialized legal protection. Imagine a peasant, remember Thomas, from the rye fields. He might occasionally be required to work a few days in the Lord's vineyard as part of his feudal duty, but he will rarely, if ever, taste the final product. His focus remains entirely on the rye and the barley. For him, the vineyard is a source of labour, but the value resides with the Lord. This contrast highlights that the grapevine value is overwhelmingly top-down. It is dictated by the consumers at the apex of society. Furthermore, unlike legumes, the grapevine does nothing to improve the soil. In fact, it requires constant maintenance and can even exhaust specific nutrients. It does not integrate into the essential three-field rotation system that sustains the general population. Its value is entirely external to the peasant's core survival cycle. So, while the vineyard provided an indispensable sacramental product, generated massive commercial capital for the elites, and represented the peak of fixed asset value per acre in wine-producing regions, its geographic limitations and its non-essential status for mass survival mean it cannot claim the overall crown of the most valuable crop. It is the king of regional prestige and religious necessity, but not the foundation of the continent's life. It is the Rolls-Royce of the medieval crop world, highly valuable to the owner, utterly useless to the starving masses. You move further south, leaving the damp, lonely fields of northern Europe and the terraced vineyards of the central valleys. You're now standing on a dry, rocky slope, perhaps in Tuscany or Andalusia or Greece. There, the agricultural landscape is dominated by a tree that embodies patience, resilience, and a different kind of concentrated value. The olive tree, Alea ripea. The olive and its product, olive oil, represent the absolute gold standard for caloric, economic, and industrial value throughout the Mediterranean world, acting as a direct counterpoint to the cereal dominance of the north. In this region, the olive tree is not merely a crop, it is a pillar of civilization. It provides food, light, medicine, and industrial lubricant. Unlike the annual necessity of planting the grain you saw in Picardy, the olive is a long-term commitment. A young tree takes many years to bear fruit, but once established it can produce for centuries, making its value inherently tied to permanence and stability. The mainstream historical fact establishing the olive's immense value is its central role as the primary source of fat and caloric energy in the Mediterranean diet. In the north, the primary fat sources were animal-based lard or butter, but in the arid south, olive oil filled this nutritional gap entirely. It is a highly efficient, concentrated calorie source, essential for the health and survival of the population. Just as importantly, it was the universal cooking medium, shaping the flavour and preparation of all food. Without olive oil, the Mediterranean diet, and therefore the Mediterranean population, could not exist in its medieval form. But the value of the olive tree goes far beyond the kitchen. Olive oil was the indispensable fuel for light. It powered the lamps in every home, church and monastery, from Spain to the Levant. Its requirement for religious ceremonies was second only to wine. It was used for anointing for the lamps and sanctuaries and for general illumination. This dual utility, as both a necessary foodstuff and an essential industrial fuel, gave olive oil a pervasive, non-negotiable value across the entire economy. The production process added further value. Olives had to be harvested, often laboriously by hand, and then pressed in specialized olive mills. The mills themselves, fixed, expensive assets, were often controlled by the local lord or monastery, just like the grain mills in the north. The owner of the olive mill effectively controlled the most valuable processed commodity in the regional economy, leading to lucrative monopolies and rent extraction. The value of the olive, therefore, was magnified by the control over its processing. Now consider a quirky or fringe tidbit that illustrates the extreme preservation efforts related to olive oil. The practice of storing oil in massive ceramic jars, pithoi, that were often partially buried in the ground. Because rancidity was a constant threat, and fresh oil was a huge investment, great effort was put into stable storage. The discovery of a well-preserved cache of medieval pithoi in an old estate storage room is like finding a hidden bank vault today. The sheer size and cost of this specialized storage infrastructure underscores the high, lasting value attributed to the oil. The trade value of olive oil was immense. It was shipped in large ceramic amphitheria across the entire Mediterranean basin, acting as a crucial element of the long-distance trade networks maintained by cities like Venice, Pisa, and Amalfi. Unlike perishable cereals, olive oil was relatively stable for transport and possessed a high reliable value at its destination, making it an excellent commodity for merchants to base their ventures upon. This powerful regional dominance raises a fascinating question for our evaluation. Historians still argue whether the functional versatility of the olive food, fuel, soap, lubricant in the Mediterranean region rendered it more economically critical and inherently valuable than the geographically limited, albeit life-saving, brewing function of barley in the north. Both provided stability, and both were essential to their respective diets, but the olive was simultaneously a calorie source and an energy source light. The olive also played a strategic role in the military economy. Beyond lighting camps and providing rations, olive oil was used as a lubricant for siege engines, tools, and weapons. An army operating in a region with abundant olive oil had a massive logistical advantage over one fighting in a region without. This industrial utility adds another layer to its worth that cereals generally lacked. In summary, the olive tree and its oil held the position of the most valuable crop in southern Europe based on multiple criteria. Caloric necessity, it provided the essential fat and calories for the majority diet. Industrial utility, it was the universal fuel for light, critical for both domestic and religious life. Longevity, the value was tied to ancient long-producing trees, representing a stable generational asset. Trade commodity, it was a reliable high-value bulk product for maritime commerce. However, just as wine was limited by climate, the olive tree also suffers a fatal flaw in its bid for the overall crown: geographic restriction. The olive cannot be grown reliably north of a certain latitude, placing it outside the primary agricultural engine of medieval Europe, which stretched from England to the Hungarian plain. It also does not integrate into the northern three-field system, and does not produce a bulk quantity of easily milled flour for the millions of landlocked peasants who needed daily bread. The most valuable crop must be the one that sustains the largest proportion of the population and underpins the broadest political structure. The olive's value is absolute within its zone of influence, the Mare Nostrum, but its inability to grow where the greatest population density was forming the north and central plains means it must yield the overall title to a more geographically versatile contender. You now have the two great regional kings, grain in the north, olive in the south, both commanding massive essential value, but neither being truly universal. The comparison shows how deeply context dictates value. You have toured the caloric mainstays of the north and the oily resilience of the south. Now, let's leave the dinner table entirely and consider a set of crops whose value lay not in the stomach, but in the wardrobe and on the ships, the industrial crops, specifically flax for linen and hemp for rope and canvas. These crops were utterly indispensable because they clothed the medieval world and enabled its commerce and warfare. Their value is one of manufacturing and infrastructure. Think for a moment about your own clothing. In the medieval world, wool was king in northern Europe, but wool alone could not satisfy the massive demand for textiles. This is where flax steps in. Flax is the raw material for linen, and linen was essential for the layers worn closest to the skin, shirts, shifts, and underwear, because it is smooth, cool, and easily washed, a major concern for hygiene, even by medieval standards. The mainstream historical fact here is that the cultivation and processing of flax was a massive, decentralized and essential industry. From the planting of the seeds, to the arduous process of retting, soaking the stalks to separate the fibers, to the hackling, spinning and weaving, flax production was a constant cycle of labor, often dominating the lives of women in the peasant economy. The final product, linen cloth, was a universally accepted commodity, tradable and valuable everywhere. It was the clothing of choice for the poor, and the essential foundation as underclothes for the rich. Therefore, the value of flax is the value of mass-produced necessity and personal hygiene. Compare the value of flax to wheat. While wheat provided the calories to keep the weaver alive, flax provided the finished product that protected the weaver from the elements, and allowed her to present herself to the world. A man could not pay his tithe in flax, but he could certainly trade a bolt of linen for the silver needed to purchase grain in a lean year. Now, let's turn to hemp, cannabis sativa, though not for its psychoactive properties in this context. Hemp carried a distinct and incredibly high strategic value. Its strong, durable fibers were the essential raw material for two critical components of the entire medieval power structure: rope and canvas. Without rope, no ship could sail, no well could be plumbed, no heavy stone could be lifted to build the cathedrals and castles that define the age. The rigging, mooring lines, and anchor cables of every trade cob and war galley were made of hemp. The value of hemp is thus tied directly to the value of trade and warfare. Control over the source of quality hemp was a military and economic imperative. A shortage of hemp would effectively ground naval power and paralyze construction. And without canvas, heavy hemp cloth, ships could not carry the great wind-catching sails that drove the maritime economy. Furthermore, canvas was essential for basic heavy-duty applications like sacks for grain transport, protective coverings, and in military use for tents and even protective padding beneath armour. This necessity generates a great quirky or fringe tidbit about the economic geography of hemp. The best quality hemp for naval use was often grown in specialised, often damp and controlled areas near water sources, and its quality was rigorously tested. The difference in price between high-quality ship's hemp and lower-grade fibre could be immense. The fact that an entire agricultural subsystem was dedicated to producing a fibre that could withstand the rigours of the sea illustrates the strategic premium placed on this industrial crop. The economic infrastructure surrounding these crops was massive. There were specialised markets for raw flax and hemp fibre, for spun yarn, and for finished cloth. The textile industry was, arguably, the largest employer in medieval Europe outside of agriculture itself. Centres like Flanders built immense wealth and political influence entirely on their ability to source, process and weave fibres, primarily wool, but always relying on flax for the foundation of their trade. This interdependence brings us to the core scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the value added by the manufacturing process to industrial crops like flax and hemp, which created massive employment and complex trade networks, made them economically more valuable than the raw, unprocessed caloric value of the cereals. The transformation of flax fibre into finished linen cloth added exponential value through human labour and skilled craftsmanship. A bushel of wheat may feed a family, but a bolt of fine linen may buy them a small cottage. The value of these crops is also one of portability and exchange. Linen and rope were non-perishable, or at least long-lasting, and could be easily traded as a standardized measure of wealth. They were a more stable, less perishable commodity than grain, which could spoil rapidly if not stored correctly. Imagine the lord collecting his rents. He wants grain for his table and his reserves, but he also often requests payment and man days of labour or specific finished goods. A peasant might be obligated to provide a certain number of yards of spun flax yarn or a specific length of hemp rope as part of his feudal dues. This indicates that the lord valued the ability of the peasant to provide an essential manufactured good derived from these crops, recognizing their utility and tradability beyond the raw caloric content. In conclusion, flax and hemp represented the essential foundation of the medieval industrial and logistical complex. Flax provided the universal textile for comfort and hygiene, and hemp provided the strategic infrastructure, rope, canvas for trade and war. Their value is high, concentrated, and absolutely indispensable for the operation of the medieval state and its trade networks. However, like the olive, they do not provide the primary bulk calories required to keep the majority of the population alive and able to perform the demanding labour of processing these very fibres. The value of the industrial crop is high, but it is ultimately a secondary value. The workers must be fed before they can spin the flax. The true king must satisfy the primary need first. We've seen how essential flax and hemp were for clothing and commerce, but the value of those textiles and the social status they conveyed was hugely amplified by the application of colour. In the medieval world, colour was expensive, difficult to achieve, and a powerful visual indicator of wealth and profession. This brings us to a class of crops with a deceptively high economic value, the dyestuffs, especially woad for blue and madder for red. Their value is entirely one of artifice, fashion, and concentrated trade profit. Imagine a peasant woman's drab unbleached linen or wool tunic, and then picture the shimmering deep blue garment of a wealthy merchant, or the scarlet robes of a cardinal. That colour gap represents a monumental leap in economic value. The difficulty of obtaining reliable, fast and vibrant colour meant that dyed cloth was worth significantly more than undyed cloth, and the crops that provided the best dyes were therefore highly coveted. The mainstream historical fact here is the incredible processing required to extract the dye from Woda satis tintoria. Wold provided the only reliable source of deep blue dye in Europe before the widespread import of indigo, which only ramped up later. The leaves of the woad plant must be harvested, then ground into a pulp, rolled into balls, allowed to ferment, dried, and then re-fermented in a separate process with a special autumn pungent solution, sometimes involving urine, to extract the indigo compound. This complex, smelly, multi-stage process meant that the raw crop was constantly being transformed into a high-value industrial product, creating wealth not just for the farmer, but for the specialist processors, the woad men, and the powerful drapers' guilds who controlled the finished product. The strategic and economic importance of Madder rubia tinctorum, which provided a range of vital red hues, was equally immense. Like flax, madder required specific rich soils and careful patient cultivation. Its root, which contains the dye, had to be dried and ground. Red was perhaps the most complex and expensive colour to achieve, making madder a premium product that supported the powerful textile industries of regions like Flanders and the Low Countries. Now, let's explore a quirkier fringe tidbit that reveals the high-stakes nature of the dye-stuff market, the monopolization of woad production and sales. Certain European regions, particularly the area around Toulouse in southern France, known for its excellent woad, often called pastel, became incredibly wealthy, generating fortunes that built magnificent urban palaces for the merchant families. This pastel blue became an international brand. These merchants were so powerful that they actively suppressed the introduction of new, better or cheaper blue dyes, like true indigo from the East, fearing it would devalue their local monopoly. The value of wood was therefore artificially maintained by corporate and political protectionism. This concentrated wealth creation leads to a crucial economic debate. Historians still argue whether the leverage provided by these high-value, highly processed industrial crops, dyestuffs, which fueled elite fashion, international trade, and powerful guilds, was more transformative to the overall medieval economy than the diffused necessary value of the staple food crops. While the peasants' income relied on selling bulk rye, the merchants' stratospheric wealth depended on selling tiny quantities of processed woad. This wealth, in turn, funded the very trade expeditions that brought back the spices we discussed earlier. The value of woad and madder wasn't just in the money they brought, it was in the status they conferred. Colour was an instant marker of the wearer's class. Only the richest could afford the deep saturated blues and reds achieved by these dyes, while the poor were relegated to the dull natural colours of undyed wool and linen. A lord's prestige, his ceremonial power, and his ability to project status relied directly on the successful cultivation and trade of these humble plants. Consider the contrast with a food crop. If the wheat harvest fails, the value of all remaining wheat spikes immediately to a panic-driven life-or-death price. If the woad crop fails, nobody starves, but the price of blue cloth skyrockets, and the rich wear less blue. This highlights the fundamental difference in the type of value. One is survival value, the other is discretionary prestige value. However, the dyestuffs were an essential part of the industrial value chain that followed grain. You need grain to feed the woad farmer, and you need flax and wool to dye. Their value is secondary but transformative. They take a basic necessary product, cloth, and increase its final market value exponentially. Without the vibrant colours of woad and madder, the textile centres of Europe would have been far less wealthy, and their final products far less desirable on the international market. Imagine a medieval taxation system. It is much harder for the lord to assess the quality of a year's madder crop than it is to simply measure the number of bushels of rye harvested. Dyestuff value is subject to specialised knowledge, processing costs, and the winds of the international fashion market. Grain value is subject to one simple metric. This simplicity is often the true measure of extractable value for the feudal system. Woad and madder demonstrate that the medieval world was not solely focused on subsistence. It was highly sophisticated in its manufacturing and trade. The crops that supported this sophistication, the industrial crops, carried a high leveraged value that created incredible concentrations of individual wealth. But, just like saffron, their narrow utility and small acreage prevent them from claiming the title of the most valuable crop for the entire continent. They are the high-profit margin item in the economy, but not the irreplaceable foundation. Their power is in their colour, but the power of grain is in life itself. We've explored the high-status grain, the trading luxury, and the industrial power of dyes. Now, we must turn to the silent hero of the medieval field, the crop whose value wasn't in its prestige or its price tag, but in its ability to single-handedly solve the medieval protein deficit and revolutionize soil fertility. The legumes, beans, peas and vetches. Imagine a peasant's diet built almost entirely on cereal carbohydrates. It's heavy, low energy and lacks essential nutrients. The great equalizer, the crop that provided necessary protein for muscle repair and sustained labour, was the humble legume. Peas pudding, bean pottage and lentil stew were the constant companions of bread and ale. Without them, the medieval diet would have been nutritionally catastrophic, leading to a much weaker, less productive labour force. The value of legumes is, therefore, the value of physical labour and human capital. The mainstream historical fact that elevates the legume beyond a mere foodstuff is its unique biological property, nitrogen fixation. Peas and beans, through a symbiotic relationship with bacteria in their root nodules, pull nitrogen from the atmosphere and deposit it into the soil. This is, quite literally, the medieval version of a highly advanced, naturally regenerating fertilizer system. Nitrogen is the key limiting nutrient for the bulk grain crops, especially wheat, which drains the soil relentlessly. By planting a field with legumes in the spring-sown rotation, remember that three-field system, the land was not just producing a vital protein source, it was simultaneously self-fertilizing itself for the next highly valuable cereal crop. This dual function, feeding the people and feeding the soil, makes the legume crop's value absolutely indispensable to the entire agricultural system. Legumes did not just add value to themselves, they directly and reliably increased the future value of the wheat and rye crops. A good bean harvest meant a good wheat harvest the following year. Now, let's consider a quirky or fringe tidbit that underscores the social value of beans: the medieval love of fasting and religious observance. The Church decreed numerous fast days, during which the consumption of meat, eggs and dairy was forbidden. This made plant-based protein sources, particularly beans and peas, absolutely critical for maintaining caloric and nutritional stability throughout the year, especially during the long lean period of Lent. The value of the legume crop was therefore directly tied to the religious calendar, ensuring that the population could adhere to doctrine without collapsing from malnutrition. This elevated the bean from a simple dietary addition to a tool of piety and compliance. The integration of legumes into the three-field rotation system — remember that field 2 was often planted with spring-sown crops like barley, oats or legumes — was the final, ingenious step in optimizing medieval agriculture. The field that grew a legume crop was effectively recovering its fertility faster and better than a simple fallow field. This realization allowed estates to intensify their production, leading to higher yields across the board and supporting a larger population. The legume was the hidden engine of the medieval population boom of the High Middle Ages. This functional complexity gives rise to a compelling scholarly question. Historians still argue whether the leverage value of the legume crop, its ability to ensure the successful yield of the much more highly valued cereal crop, makes it the most economically important crop overall, despite its lower market price. Is the crop that enables the most valuable commodity, wheat, more important than the commodity itself? It's a classic chicken and egg argument rooted in agricultural economics. Imagine you are the lord of the manor. You know your tenants will pay their dues in wheat and rye. But you also know that if you mandate that a portion of the rotation must be given over to beans and peas, your overall total grain yield from the entire estate will be higher and more reliable in the long run. The legume crop is the management tool that ensures your primary revenue streams remain stable. Its value is one of sustainable management and risk mitigation. Furthermore, legumes provided essential dietary diversity. While the staple was bread, the ability to supplement this with a variety of beans and peas helped guard against single-point nutritional failure. They were storable, hearty, and provided a dense food source that could be preserved through the winter. This characteristic of storable sustenance made them an essential component of strategic reserves, second only to grain itself. You see a woman shelling dried peas, her hands moving quickly and automatically, a scene of domestic industry. This is a common, constant activity across every household. The peas are drying to be stored in sacks or bins, a crucial guarantee against the lean months of late winter and early spring, before the new crops can be harvested, the infamous hungry gap. In conclusion, the legume crop, encompassing beans, peas and related vetches, holds a unique and powerful position in the hierarchy of medieval crop value. It is the only crop that simultaneously provided essential protein for the masses, was a staple during religious fasts, and regenerated the very soil required for the financially and politically superior grain crops. It is the unglamorous, indispensable maintenance worker of the medieval field. Its value is arguably the highest in terms of systemic functionality and long-term sustainability, proving that sometimes the most valuable thing isn't the one that sells for the most money, but the one that makes everything else possible. The value of legumes is in their support of the cereal king, making them the power behind the throne. You've acknowledged the massive systemic value of legumes, the protein and nitrogen powerhouses. But now we must ascend one last step in the agricultural hierarchy, moving from the great open fields to the small, enclosed plots that hub the peasant cottages, the garden nor craft. Here, the true measure of survival often lay, placing a quiet, often unrecorded, but absolutely critical value on crops like cabbages, onions and root vegetables, the hidden insurance policy against grain failure. Walk out of the vast communal strips of wheat and rye, and you'll find this tiny fenced-off patch, often messy, intensely cultivated and teeming with life. This mainstream historical fact is often overlooked by chroniclers obsessed with the grain tithe, but the peasant's garden provided an indispensable layer of nutritional security and variety. It was here that the crucial gap between subsistence and starvation was often bridged. The cabbage, Brassica oleracea, in its various forms, kale, collards or headed cabbage, was the cornerstone of this garden. It was hardy, could be planted and harvested multiple times a year, and, most importantly, could be preserved through fermentation as sauerkraut or simple salting. The ability to store a vegetable through the winter, providing greens and essential vitamins when fresh produce was impossible to find, gave the cabbage an immense hidden value as a health and longevity crop. Root vegetables, parsnips, turnips and carrots, though carrots were often white or purple, not the orange we know today, also played this vital role. They could be left in the ground until the last possible moment, or successfully stored in root cellars or clamps, providing dense, starchy calories during the hungry gap of early spring when the cereal reserves were dangerously low. The value of these crops is one of insurance and redundancy. If the great field's grain harvest was poor due to drought or blight, as it often was, remember Section 4's danger, the Lord's granary would demand its due first. The peasant family would face disaster. It was the humble, untaxed, unrecorded yield from the small garden that might buy them the time and energy to survive until the next cycle. The crop that literally prevents starvation carries a value that is infinite in the moment it is needed. Now let's consider a quirky or fringe tidbit about the economic function of the cabbage patch. It was often seen as the exclusive pure view and economic independence of the peasant woman. While men managed the heavy labour and the high-value grain crops, the garden was frequently the woman's domain. She controlled its output, often bartering surplus cabbages, onions or herbs at the local market for small items or even pennies needed for household necessities. This tiny plot was a source of female economic autonomy, however limited, and a demonstration that the true value of a crop sometimes lay in who controlled its production and use, rather than its size. Because these garden crops were almost never subject to the tithe or feudal rent, they were considered too trivial and too difficult to assess. They represented 100% value retention for the peasant family. Every cabbage head grown was pure value, retained and consumed directly by the family, unlike the 70-90% of grain that was potentially alienated by the lord or the church. This untaxed personal value makes them incredibly important to the microeconomy of the medieval family. This unrecorded value leads to a challenge for historians. Historians still argue whether the cumulative, untaxed and risk-mitigating value of personal garden produce, which rarely enters the formal record, ultimately accounts for a greater proportion of the average peasant family's actual survival resources than official accounts suggest. We know more about the lord's exotic spices than the peasant's ubiquitous turnip, yet the turnip was far more critical to the society's survival. Furthermore, these garden staples provided essential elements often missing from the cereal and legume diet. Onions, garlic and leeks were not just flavourings, they were medieval forms of folk medicine, believed to ward off illness and infection. Their perennial nature and ease of storage added to their critical value. Imagine the onset of winter. The great stacks of grain are locked in the lord's barn. The only things accessible to the peasant are what they have managed to save and store from their own small garden. The value of that root cellar full of preserved cabbages and parsnips is absolute. It is the physical manifestation of the family's survival strategy. When the snow is deep and the wolves are howling, a bushel of stored grain might attract a tax collector, but a carefully hidden pile of turnips is pure private security. The crops of the garden, therefore, represent a different metric of value: practical, untaxed utility and nutritional insurance. They didn't fund the Crusades or build cathedrals, but they ensured the continuation of the human capital, the farmers, who did grow the crops that paid for those things. A sick, scurvy-ridden peasant can't harvest wheat. A peasant who ate cabbage all winter might still be weak, but they would be alive and able to work the fields in the spring. The peasant's garden offers a quiet, powerful reminder that the true value of a crop is often measured in the difference between life and death at the very bottom of the social ladder. While wheat is the political king, and saffron the monetary prince, the cabbage and the turnip are the personal lifebooks. They didn't produce wealth for the ruling class, but they ensured the existence of the labour class. Because the most valuable crop must be the one that underpins the entire society, we must acknowledge the crucial, if humble, role of the garden as the essential safety net for the cereal economy. It's the final bulwark against systemic collapse, proving that not all value is loud or high-priced. You've weighed the value of cereal against luxury, industry, and the essential garden plot. All our calculations so far have assumed a baseline of stability, a world where the next harvest is merely a concern, not a certainty. But the medieval world was brutally punctuated by periods where that assumption was violently revoked. The ultimate test of a crop's value is its performance under the most extreme duress, specifically, the era of widespread crop failure that preceded and accompanied the monumental trauma of the Black Death. Imagine the decade preceding the plague, known as the Great Famine, 1315-1317. This wasn't a shortage, it was a deluge of rain followed by widespread crop rot, creating a systemic failure that demonstrated the terrifying fragility of a society built almost entirely on the successful annual yield of grain. In these moments of existential crisis, the value metrics we've used, price per ounce, social prestige, even tax revenue, all collapsed. The only metric that mattered was survival. The mainstream historical fact is that during the Great Famine, the price of wheat and rye soared to unimaginable heights, in some places increasing by 800% or more. This price surge wasn't a sign of increased wealth. It was the ultimate indication of desperate, non-negotiable necessity. The remaining grain held an infinite value because it was the last thing standing between a family and death. People didn't just spend their coin. They mortgaged their land, sold their goods, and gave up their children just for a few meagre sacks of edible grain. This proves that, at the moment of failure, the bulk calorie crop held the absolute highest non-substitutable value. But the failure of the cereal crop also highlighted the systemic weakness of relying too heavily on it. Because the peasant economy revolved around paying dues and grain, when the grain failed, the entire feudal structure fractured. Lords couldn't collect rent, merchants couldn't trade, and the population, weak from hunger, became hyper-susceptible to disease. This starvation laid the groundwork for the demographic catastrophe to come. Then, the Black Death arrived in the mid-14th century. While the plague itself was not a crop failure, it triggered a massive and immediate economic shock by decimating the labour force. Up to 50% or more of the population died. This sudden scarcity of human life profoundly redefined the value of everything in the medieval world, especially the crops. For a quirky or fringe tidbit, consider the massive shift in the valuation of oats immediately following the plague. With so many people dead, vast tracts of arable land, the high-value wheat and rye fields was suddenly abandoned. These fields quickly became suitable for grazing. Furthermore, the surviving labourers demanded higher wages and preferred to work in less strenuous, more profitable tasks. Many remaining lords, unable to secure enough peasant labour to continue the intensive heavy plough cultivation of wheat, switched to less labour-intensive forms of agriculture, primarily raising livestock, sheep for wool and meat, and cattle. The sudden shift caused a massive long-term increase in the demand and therefore the value of oats and barley to feed the vastly expanded animal population, subtly challenging the dominance of high-status wheat. The Black Death's labour shock forced a permanent re-evaluation. Historians still argue whether the long-term, structural economic shift caused by the Black Death, where the value of labour increased drastically relative to the value of land and crops, ultimately led to a permanent decrease in the real, life-sustaining value of bulk cereal in favour of other goods. With fewer people, there was less demand for grain, which initially kept prices down, though they soon recovered due to shifting currency values. The surviving peasant had more bargaining power and, often, access to better land. They could, for the first time, diversify their diet and reduce their dependence on the single cereal stalk. The famine and plague also proved the supreme, though humble, value of the legume and the garden crops. Remember the cabbage and peas. These plants, which required less land and could be grown with retained labour, provided a necessary cushion. The peasant, who had wisely preserved a stock of dried beans and cabbages, was far more likely to survive the dual horror of famine and pestilence than the peasant who had relied entirely on a good wheat yield that could be instantly seized by taxman. The crops that provided nutritional diversity proved to be a critical insurance policy. The value of the vineyard and luxury crops like saffron and spices took a temporary dip during the initial shock, but their high-status value quickly recovered, even appreciating because the newly rich survivors, the ambitious merchants and the better-off peasants, now had the means to afford these luxuries. This proved that luxury value is recession-proof for the elite. It's the last thing they stop buying and the first thing the newly wealthy start buying. However, their contribution to systemic survival remains zero. The experience of crop failure and demographic shock confirms the ultimate, non-negotiable value of cereal grain as the primary calorie source. When it fails, society fails catastrophically. The Great Famine demonstrated that no other crop, no matter how high its price, could fill the caloric void left by the loss of the grain harvest. The shock of the plague, however, revealed that the system built on that grain was brittle. It forced a necessary appreciation for the crops that supported diversification. Legumes and the animals that fueled the new, less labour-intensive agriculture, oats and barley. The lesson is stark. The most valuable crop is the one that prevents your political structure from dissolving into anarchy and starvation. In 1316, that was the tiny remaining stock of rye and wheat, and its scarcity gave it an infinite, tragic value. You have cycled through crisis and famine, proving that in moments of extreme stress, the raw caloric value of cereal reigns supreme. Now, let's apply a different lens to the question of value, the labour value. The worth of a crop can also be measured by the sheer human energy, time and specialised skill required to bring it to harvest. The value of a crop in this light is the value of the human capital that must be invested. Imagine yourself as the lord of the manor, allocating your precious resource, the time and effort of your tenants, across the fields. The most valuable crop is arguably the one that provides the maximum return for the minimum input of scarce labour, especially in the post-plague era, where labour became the most expensive commodity. The mainstream historical fact here is the relative simplicity of cereal grain labour. While planting with the heavy plough was arduous, and milling was intense, the labour per unit of caloric output was relatively low compared to many other crops. Once sown, the fields required periodic weeding, and then a concentrated burst of energy for the harvest, reaping and threshing, often managed communally. This relative efficiency in bulk calorie production is a massive source of value. Grain cultivation was scalable. You could feed hundreds of people with the output of a single coordinated plough team. Contrast this with the investment required for the high-value luxury crops. Recall the saffron crocus. To get a single pound of that spice, you needed tens of thousands of individual hand-picked flowers, each stigma delicately removed before dawn. This is a labour model built on micro-scale intensity and specialised manual skill. The labour cost of saffron was stratospheric. Its high market price was essentially paying for the concentrated labour of thousands of person-hours, making its value one of extreme, concentrated labour input. Similarly, processing industrial crops demanded intense, multi-stage specialised labour. Think of the retting, scraping and hackling of flax to produce fine linen fibre, or the complex fermentation and grinding required for woad dye. These crops required a specialised skill set and sustained effort after the harvest, adding tremendous value through manufacturing, but demanding far more specialised human capital than simply threshing wheat. This difference in labour required creates a unique, quirky or fringe tidbit about the economic function of the peasant calendar, the harvest spike. The value of the cereal crop was so immense that virtually all other economic and social activity ground to a halt during the annual cereal harvest, usually August. Everyone, from the children to the elderly, was pressed into service because the entire year's survival was dependent on getting the bulk grain in quickly and safely before the weather turned. This communal, overriding labour demand proved the supreme priority of the cereal crop. No other crop commanded this universal existential labour spike. The fact that the entire rhythm of medieval life stopped for the grain harvest is the ultimate testament to its value. This labour disparity leads us to a crucial measurement problem. Historians still argue whether the most valuable crop is the one that requires the least labour to produce mass calories. Cereals, or the one that supports the highest wages for specialised labour, luxury or industrial crops. If you measure value by the efficiency of feeding the many, grain wins. If you measure value by the amount of profit generated per unit of human labour, saffron or fine woven linen might win. The value of the grapevine also required specialised labour, pruning, trellising and careful pressing, but this labour was localised and highly seasonal. The value of the olive was tied to the intense but concentrated labour of harvest and the operation of the fixed capital olive mill. Both were labour-intensive and resulted in high-value products, but neither involved the vast, coordinated communal labour required for the staple food supply. The legume crop also shines under the labour lens. While harvesting beans and peas required effort, their function as soil regenerators, remember the nitrogen fixation, dramatically reduced the labour needed on the same field the following year for wheat crop, by reducing the necessity of long fallow periods. This saving in labour and land use time adds massive indirect value to the legumes, proving that sometimes the most valuable crop is the one that acts as a labour subsidy for the most important crop. In the post-Black Death world, the scarcity of labour became the new economic reality. Lords, unable to command the forced labour corvée they once enjoyed, had to switch to less labour-demanding cash rent systems, or, as noted, convert land to pasture. This demographic shock fundamentally altered the labour value calculation. But it didn't dethrone the king. It simply made the production of grain more expensive. The lord still needed the grain, he just had to pay more for the hands to sow and reap it. Ultimately, the most valuable crop is the one that most efficiently converts human effort into life-sustaining energy for the greatest number of people, thereby sustaining the entire labour pool. Cereal grain was by far the most effective converter of labour via the heavy plough and land into bulk caloric survival. The labour applied to saffron was for prestige, the labour applied to grain was for existence. The sheer, massive, unavoidable necessity of annually directing the majority of the population's labour toward the grain fields proves its absolute dominance in the hierarchy of value. You have now established that the value of a crop is measured by survival, monetary price, labour input, and utility. But to truly understand which crop was the most valuable to the power structure of the medieval world, you must look at what the powerful demanded for their continued existence: taxation and the tithe. The most valuable crop for the elite was the one that was most easily and reliably quantifiable, storable, and extractable as revenue. That crop was overwhelmingly grain. Walk toward the outskirts of the village now, and you'll see the tithe barn, a massive structure, often larger than the village church itself, and certainly larger than any peasant dwelling. This barn is the physical manifestation of the church's economic power, and its demand for reliable revenue. The tithe was a mandatory payment of 1/10 of all produce to the church. The mainstream historical fact is that while the tithe theoretically applied to everything wool, eggs, honey, even fish, in practice the vast bulk of the tithe was collected in cereal grain: wheat, rye, barley and oats. Why? Because grain was the most common, most easily measured by the bushel, and most efficiently stored commodity. The church required massive amounts of grain to feed its clergy, monastic orders and charitable dependents. It was the food engine of the most powerful and land-owning institution in Europe. The church's power to demand and store this specific crop elevated its value to a spiritual and political currency, a crop that pays for the salvation of the Lord's soul and the maintenance of the entire ecclesiastical hierarchy holds a non-negotiable value. Beyond the church's tithe, the secular lord's revenue followed the same pattern. The primary feudal dues paid by the peasant to the lord were also measured in or derived from the sale of grain. Rent might be paid in cash, but often the peasant owed a fixed quantity of corn. Rent, a term used broadly to refer to threshed grain or service labour, to cultivate the lord's demesnes, private land, which was primarily dedicated to, you guessed it, grain. Think about the ease of quantification. How do you assess the value of 1/10 of a peasant's cabbage crop, or the exact weight of a load of flax fibre? It's complex, open to fraud, and perishable. Now how do you assess the value of a load of wheat? You measure it in a standard bushel container. This simplicity of measurement made grain the preferred medium of taxation and extraction. The crop that is easiest to tax is the most valuable to the tax collector. This reliance on grain for revenue created a powerful mechanism of control. The Lord knew exactly what he was owed and when the harvest was due, giving him control over the annual calendar and the economic life of his tenants. The value of grain was therefore intrinsically tied to the feudal control system. Now, consider a quirky or fringe tidbit that underscores the political power of this extraction, the phenomenon of the assize of bread. In medieval towns and cities, authorities didn't just let the price of bread fluctuate wildly. They often fixed its weight and price in relation to the prevailing market price of the raw wheat or rye flour. This was done to ensure social peace and prevent panic, but it also cemented grain as the most politically sensitive and regulated commodity. No other crop, not wine, not oil, not cabbage, had its final manufactured price and weight so constantly monitored and legally controlled. The crop that requires constant government regulation to prevent riots holds immense systemic value. The very stability of the medieval tax base rested on the annual success of the grain harvest. A good harvest meant full tithe barns and prosperous demesnes, which meant the Lord could afford to hire soldiers, buy luxury goods, remember the spices and silk, and expand his political power. A poor harvest meant an immediate, simultaneous collapse of both spiritual and secular revenue streams, leading directly to social instability and potential revolt. This systemic dependence leads us to the core scholarly debate on wealth extraction. Historians still argue whether the fiscal efficiency of taxing bulk grain, which provided a reliable, storable and measurable revenue stream to the elite, outweighs the gross monetary value derived from highly profitable but volatile trade and luxury crops like spices. The luxury crops provided bursts of intense profit for a few, but the steady flow of grain revenue was the consistent funding mechanism for the entire medieval military ecclesiastical complex. Even the conversion of grain into ale, remember section 5, played into the tax system. While the peasant brewed for survival, the lord often controlled the banalities, the monopoly over high-value fixed assets like the flour mill and the large community brewery. The peasant was often required to pay a fee, often a portion of the grain or flour itself to use the lord's mill or oven. This was an indirect tax on the processing of grain, adding another layer to its extracted value. The crop that supports multiple layers of taxation and extraction, tithe, feudal rent and processing fees, is the most valuable to the ruling class. The Lord's clerk doesn't spend hours trying to calculate the worth of a basket of hedge fruit or a bale of low-grade hemp. He simply measures the bushels of grain in the granary. This administrative simplicity is key to its valuation. The church wanted grain because it was the most universal calorie source and the easiest medium to collect in bulk from disparate regions. In conclusion, the value of cereal grain is overwhelmingly confirmed as the most valuable crop to the institutions of power. It was the fundamental unit of revenue for both the church tithe and the feudal state rent and dues. Its ease of quantification, its storability, its universal necessity, and its ability to act as the primary calorie source for all dependents, clergy, soldiers, retainers, made it the cornerstone of the medieval fiscal system. While other crops were valuable to individual merchants or specialized regions, no other crop was so strategically indispensable to the institutional stability of medieval Europe. The power of the church and the crown was paid for in wheat and rye. You've journeyed through the entire agricultural landscape of the medieval world, weighing the merits of every contender. We've established that the definition of most valuable shifts dramatically depending on the metric you apply. Is it caloric density, monetary price per weight, utility for trade, or sheer necessity for survival? To finally crown the king, we must systematically synthesize these conflicting measures and establish a single criterion for overall value. Let's begin by summarizing the contenders against our three primary metrics. Caloric subsistence value survival. This is the ability of a crop to feed the greatest number of people and prevent mass starvation. Cereal grains, wheat, rye, undisputed champion, provides 70-90% of the peasant diet. Failure leads to systemic collapse, remember the Great Famine. Legumes, beans, peas, highly valuable secondary source. Provides essential protein and nutritional balance, acting as a crucial survival cushion. Olive oil, champion of the Mediterranean diet for fat and concentrated calories, but geographically restricted. Monetary commercial value. Currency. This is the ability of a crop to generate wealth, be traded over long distances, and act as portable capital. Saffron spices, absolute winner on a per-weight basis. Massive concentrated monetary value, the ultimate luxury currency. Wine silk, high value but regional or imported, generated huge fortunes for merchants and controlled by elites. Wheat, the most valuable of the bulk crops, often used as hard currency for major transactions and tax payments. Systemic utility value infrastructure. This is the ability of a crop to support the wider medieval infrastructure, military, industry, and the feudal system itself. Barley oats, critically valuable. Feeds the draft animals, logistics ploughing, and provides safe liquid hydration ale. Flax hemp dyes, essential for the textile industry, trade sales ropes and military canvas tents. Creates massive manufacturing wealth. Cereal grains, dominates the taxation and tithe system, underpinning the entire political and ecclesiastical revenue structure. Remember section 16. The mainstream historical fact is that the medieval economy was overwhelmingly agrarian, and wealth, even when expressed in silver, was ultimately rooted in the productivity of the land. Therefore, the total aggregate value, the total wealth, stability, and life support derived from a crop across the entire continent must be the determining factor. Consider this quirky or fringe tidbit about medieval economics, the concept of opportunity cost. Every acre of land dedicated to a crop like saffron or a vineyard was an acre not dedicated to grain. For the vast majority of landowners and peasants, the opportunity cost of not planting cereals was simply too high, because the risk of starvation outweighed the slim chance of striking it rich with a specialty crop. The value of a crop can, therefore, be measured by the value of the risk it mitigates. Only grain mitigates the risk of demographic collapse. The crucial philosophical question we face is one of hierarchy. Does the concentrated explosive wealth of saffron, a single ounce of which could buy 10 bushels of wheat, make it more valuable? Inescapable necessity of wheat, which could feed 100 families for a month, the greater value? This is where we must apply the ultimate arbiter, dependence. Can the spice trade survive without grain? No, because the merchants, sailors and porters must be fed, and the social structure that creates wealthy buyers must be stable. Can the wine industry survive without grain? No, because the workers in the vineyard must eat, and the monks must feed their community. Can the system of taxation, tithes and rents survive without grain? No, because the ruling class demands a storable, bulk, universal medium of extraction. The reverse is not true. The cereal economy, while benefiting from the trade funded by spices and the soil fertility provided by legumes, could survive without them. It would be a poorer, less diverse and nutritionally weaker society, but it would survive. A medieval world without pepper is possible. A medieval world without bread is not. This inherent dependence gives rise to our final, complex scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the foundational value of the staple cereal crop, its non-substitutable role as the caloric base, gives it absolute priority over all other crops, regardless of their higher specialized utility or monetary price. This argument revolves around whether necessity is a more powerful economic force than profit. We contend that in a pre-industrial high-mortality society, necessity is the ultimate definition of value. The value of the legume is high because it serves the grain crop. The value of barley is high because it fuels the brewing that makes grains safe to eat and provides the ale to pay the labourer who works the grain field. The value of oats is high because it fuels the horses that pull the plough that turns the soil for the grain. Every other valuable crop ultimately acts as either a support system, legumes, barley, or a beneficiary system, saffron, wine of the core cereal complex. The crop that provides the most universal, most reliable, most measurable, most storable, and most politically extractable form of calories, fuel, and social stability wins. That crop must be the one whose failure leads to the collapse of the state, the church, and the population itself. As you stand now, looking out over the vast communal fields that define this landscape, you see the answer literally written in the earth. The amount of land, the time, the labour, the laws, the military energy and the spiritual focus invested in cereal grain production dwarfs the investment in any other single crop. It is the overwhelming answer by scale, by necessity, and by strategic importance to the institutions of power. You've traversed the fields, the markets, the manors, and the tide bonds of the medieval world, applying every conceivable metric of value, from the penny price of a spice to the survival cost of a single calorie. The data points all lead to one inescapable conclusion. The most valuable crop in the medieval world, by an overwhelming margin of scale, utility, and systemic necessity, was the collective of cereal grains, specifically wheat and rye. Final arguments must now be marshalled to confirm this coronation. The value of grain is not merely its sum total of calories, but its function as the foundational medium of medieval life, the economic, political and social engine of the age. The mainstream historical fact that clinches the argument is one of sheer scale and non-substitutability. Grain was the only crop that simultaneously fulfilled the following four indispensable roles across the entire European continent. Mass caloric base, sustaining 70–90% of the daily energy needs for the vast majority of the population. Feudal and ecclesiastical revenue, the primary measurable, storable medium for paying tithes and rents, funding the church and the state. Logistical fuel, providing the oats and barley to power the draft animals, horses and oxen that made heavy agriculture, transport and warfare possible. Currency and stability. Wheat acted as a universal, high-denomination currency for trade, while barley provided the raw material for the universal, safe liquid sustenance ale, ensuring basic public health and wage payment. No other single crop or crop category could fulfill even two of these roles simultaneously on a continental scale. Saffron offered currency but no calories. Wine offered sacramental value and elite currency, but was geographically limited and offered zero mass sustenance. Olive oil offered calories and fuel, but was restricted to the Mediterranean basin. Legumes offered protein and soil health, but could never, by themselves, sustain the caloric needs of a village. The value of every other crop, therefore, was either secondary supporting grain, like legumes and oats, or derivative only valuable because the grain-fed population created the market, like spices and silk. We must also revisit the test of crisis. When the Great Famine struck, the value of remaining grain became infinite. No amount of fine lemon, flax or madder dye could be milled into life-saving porridge. No trade monopoly on pepper could produce the bulk food needed to fill the empty granaries. The only thing that mattered was the cereal yield. The crop that literally prevents societal collapse holds the ultimate value. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit that underscores the systemic importance of the grain farmer, the medieval concept of commons rights. While the lord owned the land, the peasants often held communal rights to graze their livestock on the stubble, the remnants of the harvested grain and the fallow field. This common use of the land after the grain was harvested was essential for feeding the animals, whose manure was needed to fertilize the next grain crop. The post-harvest value of the cereal field, its ability to feed the communal animals, proves that grain was the foundation of an entire, complex, interlocking resource management system. No other crop's remnants held such widespread communal value. The simplicity of extraction by the ruling class is the final, undeniable proof. The political value of a crop is measured by the ease with which it can be quantified, seized, and turned into power. As we saw, measuring the bushels of threshed wheat or rye was the most straightforward tax assessment in the entire feudal world. This administrative ease made it the reliable revenue stream that funded castles, crusades, and cathedrals, making it the most valuable asset in the medieval balance sheet. This leaves us with the resolved scholarly debate. Historians can resolve the debate over whether caloric necessity or monetary price defines the most valuable crop by applying the principle of foundational stability. The necessary crop, cereal, creates the stable social base upon which the profitable crop, saffron, can find a market. Therefore, the necessary crop holds the greater systemic and overall value. The profit from saffron relies on the prior existence of the vast, stable, grain-fed civilization. The choice of the most valuable crop defines the society. The medieval world was defined by its struggle for subsistence and its structure of feudal control. Both depended entirely on the successful cultivation and extraction of cereal grains. It was the most planted, most consumed, most taxed, and most strategic crop of the age. The undisputed king of the medieval crop world is the simple stalk of wheat, or its hardy cousin rye. It is the source of bread, the foundation of the state, and a guarantor of life itself. Now, the light is fading, and the sounds of the medieval village are quieting down. The oxen have been stalled, the ploughshare cleaned of the heavy clay, and the peasant's family is gathered around a meagre but warm bowl of pottage, thickened with beans, and perhaps a precious spoonful of rye flour. You hear the gentle, familiar sound of the wind picking up slightly, rustling through the last dry husks in the distant harvested fields. You are no longer watching the struggle of the heavy plough or the frantic trade of the merchants. You are simply there, a silent observer at the end of the day, feeling the deep, settled peace that comes only when the most essential needs, food, shelter, and the promise of tomorrow's labour, have been met, however tenuously. But the images of the sun-drenched vine and the impossibly expensive saffron fade from your mind. Hold only the comforting, deep-rooted image of the earth, turned and waiting. It is the earth that sustains, and the cereal grain that is its purest gift to this world. The value isn't measured in silver, but in the slow, rhythmic beat of a surviving heart. Allow the quiet hum of the night to wash over you, smoothing out the sharp edges of today's knowledge. The work is done, the fields are resting, and the darkness holds only stillness and the promise of the coming dawn.